All right. So, as you know, Wednesday, yesterday, and today, we were covering Unit 1, which is sort of that tour of the world. It's called the Global Tapestry. So, we're going to finish that up today, talking about state building specifically, how do governments operate in Africa, Europe, and the Americas, the last three regions that we have not really talked about yet. Starting on next week, we're going to get into Unit 2. That's when we're going to, real history stuff. Smith is going to go over trade routes on Monday. I'm going to talk about the Mongols on Tuesday, and we'll kind of go from there. But today we're going to finish up the sort of global tapestry so we know where we're all at starting in 1200. And then we're also going to talk about kind of the similarities and differences. I'm going to do a lot of comparing, contrasting in state building between these three regions. And that's going to get us into making historical arguments. And we're going to talk a lot of thesis statements as well today. You know about the importance of thesis statements in your writing. So I want to make sure we're all clear on it. We're all feeling good as we get ready for this AP test next month. All right. So for our warm up today, we want to take a look at the homework that Smith gave y'all last night. He gave you two claims, or I'm sorry, he gave you pieces of evidence and he asked you to come up with two claims based on these pieces of evidence. So here's the first set that he gave you. And if you look at them and you read them and you kind of put them together, which is what you're supposed to do when making a historical argument, you start to realize that this is about reasons why the Abbasid Caliphate collapsed. And so you can make a claim that there were internal and external reasons for that collapse. If you notice, evidence piece A is about inside Egypt. That's an internal reason for collapse. D and C are about external threats to the caliphate, especially including the Mongols, which again, we'll talk about on Tuesday. The other one he gave y'all was about how Islam spread as a religion. And if you notice here in his claim, he gets a little bit more specific in this one than he did the last one. The first one, he just said internal and external responses, which is plenty good for a topic sentence in a paragraph in an essay. Here he gets a little bit more specific, though, and says missionary efforts, military conquests, and merchant exchanges. And if you look at those three pieces of evidence, those completely line up with that claim. But I want to kind of take this one step further, and I want to think about how religions in general spread, not just Islam. If you look at religions through world history, these are really the three main ways that religion spreads. You've got missionaries preaching the new religion. You have military conquest, where you force the new people that you've conquered to convert to your religion. And then you see religion spread through trade routes as people are meeting with other people from different regions and convincing them to, join or this new religion. So remember what I talked about the other day, that we need to kind of think about general laws of world history. And this is a perfect example of it. Religions always spread through missionary efforts, military conquest, or through trade. And once you learn that and understand that, then you start plugging in the details about specific religions. For example, you just see right here that Islam spread in all three of those ways. When you think about Buddhism, for example, typically we think of that as merchant exchanges being spread on the Silk Road as it moves towards East Asia. If you think about Christianity in the Americas, generally think more about military conquests as the Spanish and Portuguese took over in the Americas. So make sure you understand those general rules of world history and then plug in the details as you're studying and reviewing for this test. And again, it's going to make things so much easier for you. All right, so what we're going to do today is, like I said, we're going to talk about state building in Africa, Europe, and the Americas. So before we start, this says time's up, but it is not up. We're going to reset this timer here in a second. But I want you to just simply brainstorm all the different states that you can think of that were around in these three regions anywhere between 1200 to 1450. And I'm talking about anything, large empires, countries, kingdoms, even down to the smallest chiefdom that you can think of. So take about 1 minute, write down as many as you can. I'm going to try and reset this timer. There we go. So ready, go. And when the timer's up, I'm going to go to the next slide. Again, just list as many as you possibly can. For bonus points, if you can write down a few characteristics of the states, that would be great, but not required. I'm just trying to get your mind thinking about states in these areas. All right, 15 seconds. And time is up. So let's take a look at possible answers here. All right, I gave you, this is not an exhaustive list. It does not mention every single state because that would take way too much space and be way too crowded on the PowerPoint. But I listed some of the major ones that you may have listed. But one thing I want you to remember, and don't worry when you look at this list, because some of you are looking at this list right now going, I never saw some of these states. My teacher never mentioned them and they're not in my textbook. Do I need to know them? And the answer is, fortunately, you do not need to know every single one of these. Remember, the AP test is not designed to test your knowledge of African states in the 14th century, okay? So that's okay. The AP test, and especially this year's with the DBQ, is of course testing your ability to make a historical argument with documents and also bring in outside evidence. But it can be from any of these examples. If there's a question about state building from 1200 to 1450, as long as you know a couple of these, then you're totally fine. So please don't freak out if you see a list on here, a name on here, and you're going, I don't know. It's okay. All right. In fact, I'm not even going to talk about some of these today. I didn't talk about some of these in my class. So even some of my students that are watching this right now are getting kind of mad at me and going, Logero, we never talked about this. It's okay, guys. You don't need to know it. That's why we didn't talk about it. But as long as you know a couple of examples, then you're good. All right, so let's get into what you need to know about state building. Before we talk about state building in Africa, Europe, and the Americas from 1200 to 1450, let's kind of back up and take a big picture look at state building in general. Why do we even have states and governments? And again, I mean, you could talk about all kinds of different forms of governments. As I mentioned, you've talked about giant empires this year in class. You've talked about smaller kingdoms and countries, all the way down to like small city states. But no matter how big it is or how long it lasted, generally speaking, states are trying to accomplish a couple of things. One, they're trying to organize all the resources of the area. States that survive and thrive are able to figure out exactly, okay, how many people do we have? How many farmers do we have? How many soldiers do we have? How many weapons do we have for those soldiers? And how can we get more weapons for the soldiers? How much food do we have? Crops, animals, etc. And how can we make sure that everybody in our area is getting fed? Those that are able to organize and be more efficient have usually survived. And then, of course, another major role of governments in general is that they're supposed to enforce the laws and social norms of the area. You know, consider, I think we can all agree that if you break a law, you should go to jail. You should be locked up into a room for some amount of time. That's kind of agreed upon, at least in our society. But remember, the government has the power to put people in jail. You, as an individual, do not have that power. Please, please, please don't go locking anybody up in a room, even if you think they committed a crime. That's called kidnapping. It's wrong. You should not do it. Please leave it up to the government and the police force to do that. Okay? But that is a main function of governments everywhere, to enforce laws. All right, so then where did governments come from? When did they start? How did they start? Well, okay, historians are kind of, in a little bit of a disagreement about this, but I think generally speaking, we can say the first states began somewhere around 3000 BCE. So about 5,000 years ago, and about 5 or 7,000 years after the Neolithic Revolution. I don't know if you talked about the Neolithic Revolution in class this year, but remember that's when humans first began to domesticate plants and animals, started to settle down. But then it takes a while, almost 5,000 years, until we see the first real states and governments. But what's really interesting is that when you look at where these states and governments begin to pop up around the world, it happens in all different regions of the world and kind of around the same time. This was not a situation where one state starts in Mesopotamia and then everyone else hears about it. The news spreads around the world like, hey, check out this new cool idea of having a government. A lot of these popped up independently. Again, we see new states in Mesopotamia. We also see at the same time new states in Mesoamerica and kind of like what's today's southern Mexico. Well, obviously, the people in North America were not talking to the people in Asia 5,000 years ago. So these are all developing independently. Now, I just need to take a timeout real quick, pause. You know how we talked about contextualization on Monday? Some of you right now are thinking to yourself, hey, if that DBQ is about state building, I am totally going to mention all this as my contextualization. I'm telling you right now, please, please, please don't do that, okay? Remember that I said contextualization has to directly relate to the topic of the prompt and your thesis. The Neolithic Revolution is not going to directly relate to the prompt, okay? Because remember, the prompt is not going to be until after 1200. So please don't use this as contextualization, all right? I'm only telling you this for your own edification and knowledge. This is not supposed to be in your DBQ. Please don't do it. Okay. The other thing we need to consider, though, is how do governments and states keep their power? And there's a lot of different ways, but there's two that we really see in nearly every state around the world. First is the use of religion. You got to consider, no matter what religion we're talking about or what region of the world, religion is an extremely powerful tool for good and for evil. Sadly, we've seen both through world history. But you can convince large numbers of people to do all kinds of things through the use of religion. And political leaders have figured this out and they have used it to keep control. We can see this going back to like ancient Egypt, where the pharaohs were considered half god and half man. And people believed that the pharaohs were the ones that kept the Nile River flowing. That's a way of using religious power to govern. Or these days in our country, every time a politician ends a speech with God bless America, they're using religion to justify political power. And this is something we see around the world. So again, it's one of those kind of general laws of world history. If you can know that often governments use religion to keep political power, then you can plug the details in about specific examples through history and you're good to go. Or another way that governments keep control is through the economy. If governments and leaders can promise to keep the wealth coming in, to keep trade happening, that's going to keep the wealthy elites happy. It's going to keep the commoners happy. And as long as you're keeping everybody happy, you get to stay in charge of the government. Oftentimes, though, when the economy collapses, you generally see a change in the power structure of the government as well. And political leaders obviously know that. So let's take a look at how that happens in Africa and Europe and the Americas from 1200 to 1450. Okay, one similarity that we see all across those three regions is what I just said, using religion to govern. So let me give you a couple examples. The Aztec Empire in Mesoamerica, they were known for using human sacrifice in their religious worship. The story there goes that There was a belief that in order for the sun god, the good god of the Aztec religion, to continue his fight, he had to be replenished with human blood. And so the Aztecs would sometimes sacrifice humans at the temple. But now keep in mind, this was not a situation where they just like grabbed a random person off the street, brought him to the temple, and killed them. Usually the person that was being sacrificed was a captured soldier from another area after a battle, or even not even just like a regular soldier, usually like a high-ranking military official if they could. So notice, yes, there's a religious aspect to it, but it's also showing off the leader's military power and political power. Or if we switch over to West Africa and the Kingdom of Mali. Now, when you think Mali, you probably think of Mansa Musa, and hopefully you talked about him in class. He's an extremely important figure in West Africa. Remember, Mansa Musa was the one that was considered one of the richest men ever to live. And it's hard to put like exact figures on how much money did he have. And even if you could, how do you compare that to like the wealth of someone today, like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or something like that? But the point is, if you made a list of the richest people ever, Mansa Musa is definitely up there at the top. And remember, he shows this off by his pilgrimage that he makes to Mecca. And I put a picture down below in the corner of the PowerPoint here. Remember, in that pilgrimage from West Africa through North Africa to Mecca, he brings his entire court with him. He brings a ton of people, and he also brings a ton of gold. And he spends it along the trip. He gives it to the poor. He helps build schools and universities. He helps build libraries. In fact, scholars have started to realize that he spent so much money in gold that it caused the price of gold around that entire region to actually dip because he increased the supply so much. That's insane, really, when you think about it. Okay. But the point is, here he is showing off the economic power and using religion to do it, and showing that economic power to show off his political power as well, to show off the wealth of his kingdom. Or if we think about Europe, you've got the Byzantine Empire. Remember, that's what's left of the old ancient Roman Empire after the Roman Empire collapses in the western half of Europe. It continues on, for the most part, generally speaking, in Eastern Europe. The main religion there, of course, is Christianity, but it's Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which is different from Roman Catholics or Roman Catholicism, which is mainly followed in Western Europe. And you may have talked about the Great Schism. If you did, cool. If you didn't, don't worry about it too much. But that was the split between Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. That's when there were at one point 2 popes, and this pope said, I'm excommunicating you, I'm kicking you out of the church. And this pope said, no, you can't do that because I'm kicking you out. And yes, it sounds really childish, and it kind of was in many ways, because they were arguing over things like the bread that you use for communion. Should there be yeast in it or not? Like, should it rise like a loaf of bread, or should it be more flat like a tortilla? Yeah, really important stuff there that everybody cares about. But anyway, the point is, you had the Eastern Orthodox Church in the Byzantine Empire, and people saw the emperor as also the leader of the church, a term known as Caesaropapism, which, hey, by the way, that's a fun word that you can wow your friends and family with this weekend. If you talk to anybody this weekend, while using social distancing and all that. But notice the term Caesar, the head of the government, papism, like the Pope, the head of the church as well. So again, you've got political power and religious power very much intertwined. So that's kind of a similarity that we can see across the Americas and Africa and Europe, that political leaders are using religious power. But we can also see some differences. Let's think about that other way that government leaders stay in control, and that is through the economy, through trade. Okay, Mansa Musa and the other leaders of Mali were able to take control and grow their kingdom because of all the money coming in from the salt and gold trade. Remember, there were large deposits of salt and gold in West Africa. And when news of that spreads, merchants start traveling across the Sahara Desert in order to get it. And Smith is going to get into all that on Monday, so I don't want to go too far into it. But the point is, there's a lot of money coming into West Africa. And for everything that gets sold, of course, that means more tax money. And more tax money, of course, means more money for the government and more power for the government. Or consider down in South America, the Incas. Remember, the Inca Empire kind of ran down the coast of the Pacific, between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes Mountains. It was a very geographically just long empire. And so the Incas built this amazingly intricate system of roads up and down the coasts, but also into the Andes Mountains. And part of that was to keep control for the government, but also a lot of it was to help facilitate trade across the empire. Again, the more stuff that gets traded, the more stuff that gets bought and sold means more tax money for the government. But here we actually see a difference between those kingdoms and empires and what we see in Western Europe. Okay, remember that in Western Europe, ever since the fall of the Roman Empire, which, I mean, depending on how you want to date it, there's a lot of different ways you could date it, but most would agree somewhere around the 300s. Ever since then, you don't see any really huge kingdoms or empires emerging. Nothing like these other ones that we've looked at already. There were a few that kind of came and went, but then they fell apart. And the point is, when it comes to political power in Western Europe, after the fall of Rome, until about 1450 or so, it's very fluid. It's very decentralized. It's definitely a feudal system where power lies more in the hands of the wealthy landowners, very similar to what we talked about Japan the other day with the daimyo and the samurai. But one of the reasons why that's the case is because lack of long distance trade. Remember, if you think about all those trade routes across Afro-Eurasia, Western Europe is kind of off in the corner by itself and really was not involved in a lot of that trade across the Silk Roads or the Indian Ocean or the Sahara Desert routes. And so because of that, you don't see a ton of wealth coming into that area as well. And so you don't see any large governments or empires in that area. Now, I also want to think about how geography can be a barrier and limitation to the growth of kingdoms and empires. For one, it can definitely limit long distance trade. You know, think about when it comes to West Africa, we really don't see long distance trade across the Sahara Desert until the discovery of gold and salt. Before that, no one wanted to cross the Sahara Desert. Why would you risk your life doing that? Until gold and salt are discovered, those are both extremely valuable. Gold, you know, because it's gold. It's shiny and really pretty and everybody wants it and you can make really cool stuff with it. Salt, well, everybody needs salt. It makes your food taste good. Everybody wants it. And so when that happens, then you start to see that trade across the Sahara Desert. But before that, you really don't. But now think about if the Kingdom of Mali was looking to expand. They're not really able to expand across the Sahara Desert into, say, like North Africa. It's one thing to cross the desert in pursuit of riches. It's another thing if you're like a soldier in the Mali army and you're told you have to cross the desert to go fight this other army. I don't know that I'm willing to risk my life crossing the Sahara Desert in order to go fight and possibly die. That's a little much, okay? Also, if you think about South America, remember the Incas would never really spread their empire past the Andes Mountains because the Andes Mountains are really big and really hard to cross. And then if you consider rainforests in South America, you never really see any kind of large kingdom or empire that encompasses North America and South America. Because try getting through the Isthmus of Panama right there, especially with all that rainforest. So transportation and communication are limited, then the spread of a government's power is going to be limited as well. Okay, let's take a break from the whole state building thing for a second, and let's talk thesis statements, okay? I know that you've talked thesis statements all year long with your teacher.